I'm a journalist by trade. I mainly work for The Spectator. I also work for The Telegraph, The Mail, sometimes for The Sun. But my life took a different course in 2009 when I decided to get involved in education. And my reason for doing that is because I had 4 children who were then at primary school. When I married my wife, she was a full-time solicitor. But when she got pregnant with our first child, she gave it all up to become a full-time mum, which I always think of as the worst of all possible worlds because she contributes nothing to the household income, but can always beat me in an argument. So we had these 4 children. They were at a good primary school in Shepherd's Bush. But looking around, there didn't seem to be a broad choice in the state sector of good secondary schools. I myself had a pretty checkered education. I went to a good primary school, and then I went to probably the most progressive, comprehensive in England, a school called Crichton in Muswell Hill. One of the ways in which they tried to stimulate children's imagination and creativity was to have a 7-day timetable. So Monday was day 1, the following Monday was day 6, Tuesday day 7, and then Wednesday day 1 again, with the upshot that no one, including the staff, knew where they were supposed to be at any one time. It was just total chaos. The school was such a basket case that it was the subject of a Sunday Times expose by the Beatles biographer Hunter Davis called The Crichton Report, which was then published and became a bestseller. And I found myself at this school, which was a sort of national laughingstock. Anyway, I then went to a bog-standard comprehensive in Totnes in Devon called King Edward VI Comprehensive. And at the end of those 3 years, I failed all my O-levels, apart from a grade C in English literature. More or less the only thing I'd learnt after 5 years of comprehensive education, this was in the 70s and early 80s, was how to roll a joint. That was really the extent of my education. So I left school. I told my mum I didn't think I was academically bright, which is a middle-class euphemism for thick as a plank. And I took myself off to do a work experience course, tried out different trades, realised I was even less cut out for manual work than for academic work, went back to school, and very fortunately found myself in the last grammar school year of a school called William Ellis in North London, and for the first time got a really good education, went to a fantastic sixth form, and on the back of that ended up going to Oxford and doing okay. And I want my children, or back in the 2009, looking around, I thought, I want my children to have the kind of education I had at William Ellis and not the kind of education I had at Crichton. Looking around and seeing the dearth of choice in our local area in Acton in West London, my wife and I decided we had really 3 choices. We could either go private, which was more or less unaffordable with 4 children. We could move, or we could get religion, which round my way is known as on your knees to avoid the fees. My wife decided that we should probably move, and she got some. She decided we looked around for a good state school, and found one in Framlingham in Suffolk, a school called Thomas Mills. And my wife went to the lengths of actually getting estate agents' details of houses in Framlingham and putting ours up for sale in London. And Framlingham just happened to be about a mile from where my parents-in-law live. It's at the last minute I thought, no, I just can't do this. The idea of moving halfway across England and practically moving in with my parents-in-law just in order to secure my children a decent state education seems ludicrous. There must be a better way. And at that time, Michael Gove was the shadow education spokesman for the Conservative Party and was talking about free schools, and allowing parents and teachers to set up free schools had become a kind of flagship Tory education policy. And I thought, that's what we should try and do. So I wrote an article for The Observer in late August 2009 saying that I wanted to set up what I described as a comprehensive grammar school. So a school with a comprehensive intake, but a grammar school curriculum. So compulsory Latin, traditional academic subjects taught in a fairly old-fashioned way, houses, uniforms, Hogwarts meets Grange Hill. After this article was published, I published an email address and invited anyone who was interested to get in touch, and if they could lend a hand, that would be great. I got about 100 responses, and I held a meeting at my house in Acton. About 75 people crowded into our front room, and out of that group emerged about a 12-strong steering committee, and we were off to the races. One of the things that surprised me was that I immediately encountered a tsunami of opposition. For instance, I went on Radio 4's Broadcasting House with Roy Hattersley, and when I said that I wanted to start a comprehensive grammar, he became absolutely incensed. He said, "A comprehensive grammar is a contradiction in terms. It's like a vegetarian butcher." And when I had wiped the spit off my forehead, I pointed out that when Harold Wilson first unveiled the comprehensive policy in the 1960s, he had described comprehensives as grammar schools for all. So far from being a contradiction in terms, it was the original idea behind comprehensive education. But the idea of trying to teach all children the best that's been thought and said, regardless of background or ability, and trying to create comprehensive grammar schools was unwelcome within many quarters in the educational world, which surprised me. Martin Johnson, for instance, the Deputy General Secretary of one of the largest teaching unions, wrote a pamphlet in 2007 arguing that traditional academic subjects, the kind of subjects that we wanted to teach at our school, were really only suitable for children of the social elite. And working class children should be taught what he called life skills. And I'm actually quoting directly from this pamphlet. When he itemised these skills, he said, dance, different forms of sport and craft, physical skills such as walking and digging. So clearly, if you think that children who aren't academically exceptional should be taught how to walk and dig, you're not going to be particularly sympathetic to someone who wants to set up a comprehensive grammar and teach all children about the best that's been thought and said. But the NUT, the Anti-Academies Alliance, the Socialist Workers' Party, all formed this sort of maelstrom of opposition. I remember at one point the local NUT shop steward, a guy called Nick Grant, who in addition to being the shop steward of the local branch of the NUT was also on the executive committee of the Socialist Workers' Party and was a co-founder of Respect, held a meeting at the local community school and managed to persuade both the late Bob Crow and George Galloway to speak in opposition to the West London Free School. And I feel like I succeeded where Jeremy Corbyn failed. I united the left, albeit in opposition to our school. I was slightly taken aback to discover this sort of wall of opposition I'd run into when I thought that really I was just trying to do something that would benefit the local community and create a different kind of school for those parents who wanted it in our area. I thought, well, should I offer an olive branch? Should I offer to meet with them? Should we try and work out some kind of compromise whereby if I change various things, they'd be less opposed? And Dominic mentioned Andrew Adonis, and we were on Any Questions together around 2010. And on the way back to London, we shared a taxi, and he was the architect of Labour's City Academies programme and has always been quite supportive of academies and free schools. And I asked him what the best way to deal with this kind of army of opponents was. You know, should I offer an olive branch of some kind? And he looked at me, he gave me a look of withering contempt, as though he couldn't believe I was being quite so naive. And he said, they're not interested in constructive dialogue. This is a direct quote. If you extend any sort of olive branch to them, they'll see it as a sign of weakness and move in for the kill. Their attitude to free schools is the same as their attitude to academies. They won't rest until the last one has been razed to the ground. The penny then dropped that I was in a fight, and it was a fight to the death. And the way to win a fight is to hit first, hit hard, and hit often. So I suddenly became this quite belligerent. Michael Gove at one point described me as the Andy McNabb of the free schools movement. And I was fond of quoting Sean Connery in The Untouchables. You want to know how to get Capone? They pull a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. That's the Chicago way, and that's the way to get Capone. And I thought, that's the way to set up a free school. Tim asked me to reflect on what I thought I'd got right and what I thought I hadn't got particularly right, and I probably was a tad too aggressive at that particular stage. It was an important lesson, which was don't bring a knife to a gunfight. But I learnt to treat the obstacles that were thrown up in my path as reasons to try harder, one more challenge to overcome, rather than a reason to give up. An example, one of the most energetic opponents of first academies and then free schools is Fiona Miller, the partner of Alistair Campbell. And I remember appearing with Fiona on Newsnight, and we were discussing the pros and cons of the free schools policy. And midway through the discussion, in which I was just about holding my own, she turned to Jeremy Paxman and said, "Jeremy, I don't know why we're bothering to discuss Toby's school, because he's never going to do it. It's just a ludicrous publicity stunt. No parent is able to do something as complicated as to set up a state-funded school. It's completely pie in the sky. Let's change the subject." And I felt, this was absolutely devastating. And during those dark nights of the soul, when I felt like giving up because it had become so difficult, the thought of wiping that smug expression off Fiona Miller's face kept me going. Sometimes the most demoralising comments could come from people on your own side. I remember getting this guy called Jonathan Fingerhut, who had successfully led a parent group to set up the Jewish Community Secondary School in Barnet. He'd done more or less what we were trying to do, and he'd succeeded. So I thought when morale amongst our steering group was at a low ebb, I'd invite him along to come and give us a pep talk, and it would inspire us to keep going. And the first thing he said when he had the floor was, he said, "I hope you realise it's going to take you 10 years to get your school off the ground." That's how long it took my group, 10 years. And those are 10 years of your life you will never get back. And I said, I sort of thought, I've got to salvage something from this. I said, "Yes, but Jonathan, presumably if you'd known at the beginning of those 10 years that in 10 years' time you'd have this school embodying your vision, presumably you wouldn't have done anything any differently." And he said, "Are you kidding? I'm almost bankrupt, my wife's almost left me, my kid's too old to go to the bloody school. I never would have done it." That was quite demoralising. One of the unexpected sources of opposition was the then headmaster of Latimer Upper School. Latimer Upper School is next to the location of the West London Free School, and when we submitted a planning application, he wrote to every parent and member of staff at Latimer urging them to oppose our planning application, and his main reason for doing so, he said, was that the local tube platform would become so crowded with teenagers if a second school opened in the area that Latimer students would be pushed off the edge of the platform into the path of oncoming trains. It was really extraordinary, kind of inflammatory stuff, and it was all written up in the Evening Standard, and I felt a bit depressed about it because I thought, he'd be quite supportive. But Sam Friedman, then an advisor to Michael Gove at the Department for Education, said, "Toby, don't worry, that's probably the best publicity you've had yet. The reason he's opposing your school is because he's worried about competition. That is a huge compliment. Take it like that." And I did learn to try and treat the naysayers and the opponents as reasons to continue rather than reasons to give up. And one of the lessons I learned, that if you are leading something controversial which does attract a lot of opposition and which seems very difficult to achieve, if you want to keep your group together, if you want them to keep the faith, it's very important that you should never show a flicker of doubt, that you should always remain absolutely committed, a true believer, and that becomes infectious within your group. And indeed we did, as Patrick said, get the school off the ground. The West London Free School became the first free school to sign a funding agreement with Michael Gove, and it was one of the first 24 to open in September 2011. And Boris Johnson, then the Mayor of London, came and opened the school, made quite a good joke about the then Secretary of State for Education, said, "Yes, the Secretary of State for Education has added a new word to the English language. He gives, we gave, he gave us this school." An affectionate joke about Michael Gove that Boris probably wouldn't make today. Broadly speaking, the school's been a success story. One of the arguments that against free schools at the very beginning is that teachers wouldn't want to work at schools set up by parents. Why would they want to work for a bunch of amateurs? But actually we had 100 applications for our head teacher position, which is pretty unusual, particularly in the state sector. We were told that parents wouldn't want to send their children to free schools, and the argument was that if your child burst his or her appendix, you wouldn't send them to a hospital run by patients, so why on earth would you entrust your child's education to a school run by parents? In fact, our school wasn't predominantly run by parents. The group contained more teachers than parents, but nevertheless, that didn't prove to be the case either. We have about 10 applicants for every place each year. The TES put us in the top 10 of state secondary schools in England in terms of popularity last year. We were told that the school, particularly with its compulsory Latin, its comprehensive grammar ethos, its Hogwarts meets Grange Hill, all that stuff would only appeal to the local affluent middle-class population. That hasn't proved to be the case either. About 25% of the children at the secondary school are on free school meals, between 30 and 40% are black, Asian or minority ethnic. It almost perfectly reflects the local community. The school was inspected by Ofsted in 2013. It was found to be good with some outstanding features. When they come back later this year, we hope it'll be ranked outstanding. As Patrick said, we opened 2 more schools. We're about to open a 3rd in Kensington. All 3 of those are primaries. When our first primary was inspected by Ofsted last year, it was found to be outstanding in every category. Our free school isn't the only success story. The London Academy of Excellence in Newham, a free school sixth form, which was set up a couple of years ago, got more children into Oxford and Cambridge, more offers from Oxford and Cambridge this year than Marlborough, Wellington, lots of top famous fee-paying schools, more offers from Russell Group universities than from every other sixth form in Newham combined. The Westminster Harris Academy, another free school sixth form, which was set up by Harris and Westminster, again, hugely successful. Ark Conway, a free school primary set up in Acton in 2012, got the best Key Stage 1 results in England in 2014, beating even fee-paying pre-prep schools. Over 300 new free schools have opened so far. A further 138 are opening this September, creating 235,000 new school places. All the free schools that opened in 2011 and 2012 have now been inspected by Ofsted, and 71% have been ranked good or outstanding, 24% outstanding compared to 11% of all state schools inspected in the same period. And free schools are popular, not just ours. In 2014, open free schools received an average of 3 applications per place, and in 2015, open free schools attracted more first preference applications than any other type of school. Contrary to one of the criticisms, which they're only set up in middle-class areas, they're actually 10 times more likely to be in England's most deprived areas than in England's least deprived areas. As I say, Tim asked me to reflect on what had gone well and what hadn't gone so well. And just before I take questions, I'll tell you one of the things that didn't go terribly well was procurement. We didn't keep our head teachers on a tight enough rein to begin with. When the auditors came along, we discovered some purchases that the head teacher had made without, we felt, going through the proper authorization procedures, and had to do a lot of explaining in order to avoid that being written up in the regularity letter. And now we've put a pretty robust set of procurement rules in place that applies to all 4 of our schools. And in case you're interested, purchases of under £1,000 can be made by budget holders, heads of department, and so forth, from a list of the school's approved suppliers. And if they want to go off-piste and purchase something from someone who isn't on that list, they have to get the head teacher's permission. If they're buying something which is over £1,000 but less than £10,000, they do require the head teacher's consent and the business and finance manager of the school's consent, and they're expected to get at least 3 quotes, though they can get those quotes over the phone. If they're purchasing something between £10,000 and £40,000, they have to get 3 written quotes, and the purchase can't be made without the permission of either the CEO, that's me, or the finance director. And if they're purchasing, if we're making a purchase of something which is worth more than £40,000, then they have to go through a proper procurement procedure. And having put these rules in place, we now find that everything works a bit better, and there are fewer surprises when our auditors come visit. Anyway, happy to take some questions. I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions?
I'm Justin Barron. I work with a number of EdTech companies. One of my clients at the moment is very interested in parental engagement. I'm to hope that your parents are very engaged in the school, but I was wondering whether that was something you measured or looked at particularly interested in whether they log into the various sites they may have, parental portals and things like that.
Yeah, well, I think being a free school, and given that the way the policy was pitched when it was originally rolled out as an opportunity for parents to set up schools, the parents involved in the school and the parents whose children are at the school do feel, I think, a sense of ownership over the school, which is probably greater even than the sense of ownership felt by parents at local authority schools. And that reflects itself in various ways. We have a regular parent-governor forums where, you know, we usually get between 50 and 100 parents turning up, some of them to complain about, you know, the fact that their child has been given too many detentions, but sometimes to make more constructive contributions and suggestions. We have a pretty energetic PTA, both at the primary schools and at the secondary schools. We ask parents to make a voluntary monthly contribution to pay for an ambitious after-school program, which isn't funded in our GAG funding. And about 2/3 of the parents do contribute to that fund. We make it clear that if parents don't contribute, their children can still fully participate in the after-school activities. So it's not discriminatory in that sense. But a lot of parents do contribute, and they raise money in other ways as well. There is, I think, a parent section on the school's on all of the school's websites, and yeah, they do use that. So generally, I think one of the kind of more positive things about our schools is that parents do feel this sense of ownership and do participate and do get involved, probably to a greater extent than in other neighbouring schools.
Living in Cambridgeshire is a great growth area, and there's a number of new schools which are having to be developed to cope with the increase in population. My understanding is that new schools can no longer be local authority schools, they have to be free schools. So we have a landscape which is kind of forced on us in a certain way. And the question that keeps being asked is, are they more competitive, and if so, why? And are they better, and if so, why? And I find it very difficult, because going around the country you find excellent schools of very different backgrounds, whether they're local authority or free school or whatever they are. And it's generally down to the school leadership and the teaching staff that are in those schools.
Yes.
So are you attracting in your schools better staff because you have different contracts, or is it that they generally like working in free schools for some reason? That's one question. The second is wondering whether you have more money in some way, and if so, what that is and why. And the third thing is, one of the issues about parents is that generally the recommendation for local authority schools and the makeup of governing bodies is to reduce the number of parents now. And yet free schools seem to be successful because of more involvement of parents. So do you have any intelligence to understand why?
Yeah, well, to answer your last question first, one of the more controversial things in the white paper was dropping the requirement that schools should have parent governors on their governing bodies. It was actually reported as just banning parents from being parent governors, but it wasn't. It was just making it optional for schools as to whether they wanted parent governors or not. And I think that probably did send the wrong signal to parents who are involved in schools, and lots of schools do depend on, you know, public-spirited volunteers, many of them parents, getting involved and doing a lot of the governance work on a completely voluntary basis. So it did feel like a bit of a slap in the face. But certainly at our schools, we do have parent governors on all of the local governing bodies of the schools, and they contribute an enormous amount. For instance, the West London Free School Primary, the first primary we opened. We've just elected 2 parent governors, one of whom is a deputy head of Fox Primary School and the other of whom is the head teacher of Greenwich Free School. And they, of course, can contribute a huge amount to discussions at governing level. Your question about whether free schools have more money, I mean, free schools and academies are financed on exactly the same basis. So do free schools and academies get more money than schools which are still in local authorities? Well, the answer is they get the money that would otherwise go to the local authority if they were local authority schools. But apart from that, they don't get any more money. How do we attract teachers? I mean, I think all schools now have more flexibility when it comes to paying conditions, not just free schools and academies. And certainly you can, when trying to attract teachers who are hard to find, like maths teachers and physics teachers and good modern foreign languages teachers, you can offer them a bit more. You can create kind of titles such as master teacher or special teacher and offer them a bit more. We offer a small referral bonus to members of staff who refer colleagues from other schools to us and who we end up hiring to try and incentivize our staff to help us find other schools and to kind of beat the bushes on our behalf. I think the main reason, I mean, it's hard attracting, I mean, all schools are finding it hard to attract teachers, and it's particularly hard in London because of property prices and the prices of rent. But I think the reason we've been able to do it is because of our particular distinctive educational approach, believing in a knowledge-based approach, not having any technical or vocational subjects, expecting all the children, regardless of their background or ability, to do the EBAC. All of that is very ambitious. We have very, very high expectations, and that, I think, appeals to certain teachers who believe in that particular educational philosophy, and that's been our main kind of selling point, I think. Your first question was about why are academies and free schools better than local authority schools, and why should local authorities be prohibited from setting up new schools? I think partly it's about wanting to change the educational landscape. I mean, you saw in the white paper, I think, where this government and the last government want to end up, which is a much less chaotic, disorganised public education system in England, a much more uniform system in which all schools are essentially either academies or free schools, which are more or less identical anyway. And there isn't this mixture of voluntary aided, federation, local authority schools, with local authorities being given a clear regulatory role rather than a provider role. But it doesn't look like we're going to get there as quickly as the present government would like, so for the time being it'll remain a fairly kind of confused picture. But one thing I will say is that the contrast between local authority schools and free schools and academies is often much greater, is often rather much lesser than it appears to be. So quite often, really good local authority schools will become academies and then effectively clone themselves. So that's happened in Acton, for instance. One of the best local schools is a C of E comprehensive called Twyford, and it has a very dynamic head teacher called Alice Hudson, and she has created a kind of second Twyford in the north of Ealing, and she's now setting up a third school, and a policy which enables really good secondary schools, which have been thriving in local authorities, to effectively clone themselves. And it seems to me to be a good policy, and where that happens, it happens, I think, very successfully.
I'm Bob from Crossbow Education. Most of us here make money from selling stuff to schools, and I'm always curious when I hear the term list of approved schools to know how those lists are compiled, because we'd all like to be on it, really.
The list of approved suppliers?
Yeah. List of approved, not approved schools, so that's something else. So yeah, I'd be interested to know. Thank you.
Yeah. If we think that we're going to be spending more than 40,000 a year with a supplier, even though each one-off purchase is going to be lower than that, then we'll procure that supplier by going through a procurement process. So, for instance, in the case of our primary schools, we had to procure a teacher supply agency because we discovered after 1 year that we were spending more than 40,000 a year across the schools on supply teachers. And I think we went through a proper tendering process and invited different supply agencies to submit proposals, and of course, you're trying to get them to commit to as low a price as possible without any diminution in quality. And that's the general principle on which we compile these lists. I mean, in some cases, the DFE, or the Education Funding Agency, will give you a list of approved suppliers who are on one of their frameworks. For instance, when we went through a procurement to secure a cleaning firm across all of our schools, we procured that cleaning firm from the list of approved suppliers that we were given by the Education Funding Agency. It turned out that the cleaner we ended up with wasn't great, and we've now got another cleaner who we procured ourselves. I'm not actually involved in putting together the lists of those approved suppliers, but I would imagine that if it depends upon how much we're expecting to spend with that particular supplier over the course of a year, and then we have these various guidelines as to how they're procured. But as I said, if it's for a relatively small amount of money, then the department heads can go off-piece. They don't have to use one of the people on one of our lists, so provided they can get the head teacher's consent and make a good argument, even if it's not necessarily the cheapest or going to be cheaper than one of the people on our approved list, then the head will approve that. We just have to be careful that it's not people they know or have a relationship with, and they're not getting kind of a free trip anywhere or anything like that. Not that that's happened.
Toby, thank you very much. One final question for me. You've proven the naysayers wrong. They said free schools couldn't be set up by parents. You've opened 4, or about to open the 4th. You've also had warnings that it will take up your life, threaten your marriage, all the rest of it, and seem to have proven them wrong as well. If you were speaking to a parent now who was thinking about setting up a free school, what would you advise them to do it? Would you advise them that ultimately all the hard work and turmoil is worthwhile?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it has been more hard work than I anticipated when, I wrote the article in the Observer and first embarked on this journey. And when I did think, rather naively, that as soon as the children went through the gates of the first school we set up, that I would then be able to wash my hands of the whole thing and just take a back seat and watch it all kind of tick along smoothly, and then my children would duly go there. And my daughter is, in fact, at the secondary school. She started last year, and my son's going this September. But that was, as I say, naive, and I had to remain involved. And then in order to... we eventually decided that in order to make the first school sustainable, we would need to set up a multi-academy trust, and that meant opening additional schools. So now we've grown to 4, and we'd like to double or triple in size over the next 5 to 10 years. To create a kind of sustainable multi-academy trust. I'm stepping down as the chief executive in September, and we're currently looking to recruit a new full-time CEO. At the moment, I'm just part-time. But yeah, it certainly is worth it. I mean, I think it's when you see the children benefiting from what you've done, not just your own children, but other children too. That's what really kind of gives you a sense that the hard work's all been worthwhile. I'll give you just one example. There's a young Muslim girl called Ararat at the school. She's just taken her GCSEs. In fact, the secondary school will get its first set of GCSE results this summer. So that'll be our first major test. We're all keeping our fingers crossed. But when Andrew Adonis came to visit the school, I introduced him to Ararat. We bumped into her in the corridor, and he asked her what she was reading on his kind of default questions whenever he meets a student. And she said Tony Blair's biography, which sort of rather knocked him back. He wasn't expecting that answer from this kind of tiny girl. I then saw him a couple of weeks later at a Spectator Education conference, and he said, oh, I've got something for you. And he pulled out a copy of Tony Blair's memoirs, dedicated by Tony Blair to Ararat. He'd remembered, and he'd gone to the trouble to get Tony Blair to do this. And he gave it to me, and I was then able to present this book to Ararat. And it was extraordinary to see the expression on her face. I think she's on free school meals, lives on the local council estate, and the notion that this world was within her grasp and not it just in a completely another dimension, I think, was transformative. And I hope that when she does do well in her GCSEs, which I'm sure she will, and goes to our sixth form, which we're opening in September, that she will go on and become involved in British public life, partly as a result of having that kind of contact, that kind of feeling that world is within touching distance and not 1,000 miles away. And things like that, I think, are what make it really worthwhile.
Toby, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Please join me in giving her a round of applause.